Franklin Graham warns Equality Act would be catastrophic for Christians if it becomes law. The Equality Act, a bill that would add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes under federal civil rights law, would be catastrophic for Christians and churches if it becomes law, evangelist Franklin Graham warned. Graham, in a recent op-ed for Decision magazine, warned that the bill, which was introduced by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in March, would grant the same protections afforded to racial minorities and women under the Civil Rights Act to the LGBTQ community, causing significant legal problems for Christians who hold a biblical worldview. He also noted that if Democrats get control of the Senate and the White House, the bill is likely to become law. The progressive, Democratic-controlled House of Representatives has already passed this atrocious bill, and only the Republican-controlled Senate and the President stand in its way. If the Senate majority changes or if enough Republican senators change their position, it would be up to the President to veto the bill. And if that office were to change hands in 2020, I have little doubt this would become the law of the land, Graham said. This legislation will have catastrophic consequences for competitive sports, along with churches and faith-based nonprofits who would lose all protections to hire people who adhere to their biblical statements of faith. Christians will be persecuted for their sincerely held beliefs as never before. The clear teachings of the Bible on the sins of homosexuality and abortion will no doubt be considered hate speech. It will be a nightmare from which this nation may never recover, he warned. He further thanked President Donald Trump for standing up to the LGBTQ agenda last month. I want to thank President Donald J. Trump and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for making the decision not to fly the gay flag over our embassies during June in recognition of Gay Pride Month. That is the right decision. The only flag that should fly over our embassies is the flag of the United States of America. The gay pride flag is offensive to Christians and millions of people of other faiths, not only in this country but around the world. The U.S. flag represents our nation, everyone, regardless of race, religion or sexual orientation, Graham noted. A recent report from the Heritage Foundation outlines how the Equality Act would impact the lives of Christians and faith-based institutions if it should become law. Employers and workers, argues the conservative policy organization, would be forced to conform to new sexual norms or lose their businesses and jobs. Hospitals and insurers would also be forced to provide and pay for therapies against any moral or medical objections and politicize medicine by forcing professionals to act against their best medical judgment to provide transition-affirming therapies. Families, the organization argues, would suffer further harm caused by the politicization of medicine as hormonal and surgical interventions for gender dysphoric children as well as ideological education in schools and other public venues become normalized. The Equality Act, the Heritage Foundation says, would ultimately lead to the erasure of women by dismantling sex-specific facilities, sports, and other female-only spaces. Many faith-based charities, volunteers, and the populations they serve would also end up suffering. The Democrat-controlled U.S. House of Representatives passed the Equality Act Friday afternoon, hotly debated legislation seeking to codify LGBT non-discrimination protections into federal law. H.R. 5 passed by a vote of 236 to 173. The bill would expand the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to also ban discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, pregnancy, childbirth, or a related medical condition in housing, public accommodations and hiring. The bill was first introduced in 2015 but never passed in the Republican-controlled House. However, it is unlikely to be voted on in the Republican-controlled Senate. But LGBT advocates and supporters consider the bill's passage in the House historic and a sign of progress because it is the first time a comprehensive LGBT civil rights bill has come to the floor in Congress. To bring our nation closer to the founding promise of liberty and justice for all, we, today, pass the Equality Act and finally, fully end discrimination against LGBTQ Americans, Democrat Speaker Nancy Pelosi of California said on the House floor. LGBTQ people deserve full civil rights protections in the workplace, in every place, in education, housing, credit, jury duty, service and public accommodations. No one should be forced to lose his or her job, their home or to live in fear because of who they are and whom they love. Christian conservatives and religious freedom advocates have voiced strong opposition to the bill and fear it could encumber religious freedom for communities and organizations that uphold traditional teaching on issues like marriage, abortion and sexuality. Americans are becoming more tolerant every day, which is why the Equality Act is so counterproductive, Utah Republican Mike Lee wrote in a tweet. It unnecessarily pits communities against each other and divides our nation when patience and understanding are so sorely needed. With the vote along party lines, Idaho Republican Representative Russ Fulcher announced in a video Friday that he was voting against the bill and questioned if his Democrat colleagues even read the legislation before voting in favor of it. "I don't think they read it. I don't think they really understand what is in it because women's rights get eliminated," Fulcher said. Fulcher argued that the bill would erase gender from federal law. "For example, if I were a male inmate at a penitentiary and I identified as a woman that day, I could demand to be incarcerated on the female side of the penitentiary. If I were a male athlete and I wanted to be placed in the women's draw, I could identify as a woman," he said. School curriculum: it could be mandated to have transgender training. Adoption agencies could be mandated that only certain people can adopt children. The list goes on. The traditional families get eroded and religious freedom is no more because religions identify gender. Critics have expressed concern that the Equality Act opens the door for more potential legal battles spawned by the intersection of LGBT rights and First Amendment rights of religious conservatives who feel homosexuality and transgender identity is unbiblical. In response to the House vote, lawyer Kristen Waggoner, who successfully defended Christian baker Jack Phillips at the U.S. Supreme Court last year for his refusal to bake a custom cake for a gay wedding, argued that the Equality Act fails to respect constitutionally guaranteed freedoms. It undermines women's equality by denying female athletes fair competition in sports, depriving women of business opportunities designed for them, and forcing them to share private, intimate spaces with men who identify as female, Waggoner, an attorney for the Alliance Defending Freedom, said in a statement. Like similar state and local laws, it would also force Americans to participate in events and speak messages that violate their core beliefs, all in the name of an equality that tolerates no dissenters. Across the nation, conservative Christian business owners, organizations and health professionals have come under legal fire for refusing to violate their religious or moral convictions relating to various issues including abortion, marriage, sexuality, gender identity, and gender reassignment. A group of 21 Christian conservative pastors and activists including Franklin Graham and James Dobson urged members of Congress this week to vote against the bill in a letter stating that the legislation carries with it religious freedom concerns. The letter argued that the language of the bill indicates that the bill is also the largest expansion of taxpayer-funded abortion this country has ever seen. The Equality Act is unacceptable because it is anti-life and creates a right to demand abortion from health care providers, the letter contends. The termination of human life in the womb is unacceptable to any biblically and historically faithful Christian. The responsibility to care for the least of these, Matthew 25:40, is a fundamental responsibility of Christ's church, and any proposal that undermines a culture of life must be rejected. While Christian conservatives have spoken out against the Equality Act, left-leaning Christians have backed it, including Reverend Jennifer Butler, the head of the clergy network Faith and Public Life and former chair of the White House Council on Faith and Neighborhood Partnerships during the Obama administration. "My faith teaches that everyone is created in the holy image of God," Butler said in a statement. The passage of the Equality Act is an important step to make sure that the innate dignity of every person is recognized and protected in our country. Waggoner argued that LGBT activists want to con Americans into thinking that disagreement on important matters such as marriage and human sexuality is a form of discrimination that requires the government to enforce one view over another. "But that is obviously wrong," she said. "This bill undermines human dignity by threatening the fundamental freedoms of speech, religion, and conscience that the First Amendment guarantees for every citizen. Americans deserve better than the profound inequality that this intolerant, deceptively titled legislation offers." This news is brought to you by the Christian Post. This news is brought to you by the